Greetings, this is Vane and welcome back to the Elder Scrolls Arena. Okay, so we're doing the Mines of Karos and it's not particularly exciting. Tough. Not particularly exciting though. And I'm just rambling. Spent some time talking about my autism. My memory is a bit naff. Because I don't tend to. I'm not very good at encoding information and remembering what I've said or not said. You know. So yeah, which is quite interesting because it means that I don't necessarily remember what I've done, what I've spoken about. When I upload these videos, I tend not to have any idea what's in them. When I know I've recorded them, I've checked that they've been recorded. But once they're up there, unless I rewatch them, I tend not to remember. Which is ironic because it's like I can remember the storylines of films, and I can remember the plot lines of books, and I can give synopsis and remember, and that's quite how things. It's like, okay, I might not be able to describe or talk about what I can remember, or even recall what I remember, but I can remember it when I remember it, and so it's like, okay. It's like experience, it's not quite deja vu, because deja vu implies a sense of mystery. But it's like, it is a sense of remembering experiences. Like, oh yeah, I remember this experience. Oh yeah, I remember this name. Oh yeah, I remember. And that's basically what everything is like for me. It's a constant remembering pretty much everything. Some people have better memories with autism. But it kind of depends a lot on how things are encoded. Which is the technical term for how memories are stored. And for me in particular, my memory is a bit like having the internet, but without Google. Google just doesn't exist. Neither does anything else. Nothing's replaced it. It's just not there. So unless I've got links or I can remember the address, you know, then I just you know, I'm not really going to find anything. I've got no idea I've got no idea what I know and what I don't know until I know it or don't know it. I know that sounds completely stupid, but basically, if I'm in a conversation, and someone mentions something, it's like, okay, I'm constantly looking up on Google what people are talking about. You know, well, not just looking on Google. It's like, okay, because I just said I don't really have Google, and it's like, well, the principle is I don't have Google to access necessarily straight away. It's not like there's a Google web page, but at the same time, there's a process of doing stuff. There's some sort of search engine which is basically taking me straight to the first page, because I feel lucky. You know, it's like talk about cars, and I'll have all sorts of information about cars that I know, that I've learnt. I couldn't tell you what information that would appear. Couldn't tell you. So it's, you know, I mean, if we're talking about engines, it might be something about engines that I know, or if it's about social policy, I tend to know a lot more about that, because if it's something that I have kind of talk about a lot or comes up in discussion a lot, you know. Yeah. Those by the way, also another part is basically, it's like, okay, I've got all this information. What am I dealing with it? Well, that was useful, wasn't it? Probably round the back. Okay. We'll chug a potion then. But yeah, so folks, it's like talking about me, and people like the classic people asking how you are. It's like, how do you answer that question? Is it they're just being polite, and so it's a I'm fine, how are you? Or do they generally want to know how I am? Which then is like, okay, well, there's a lot of information. What about me do you want to know? Do you want to know what's going on with my life? Do you want to know how I'm thinking or feeling? Do you want to know? So in the end, you just kind of end up, you know what, data dumping and giving everyone everything. Or you don't say anything at all. You either shut the conversation down with I'm fine, or you just give them no information. And apparently, according to the assessment, the part of was actually trying to get the attention of the assessor. Apparently they monitor that stuff. But again, it's like talking here. It's like talking on these monologues, because they are mostly monologues, rambling. You know, just spontaneously saying stuff about me to keep the conversation going, really. That's described as, whether it's appropriate or not. And it's like, well, I don't know. If there's a bit of silence and feeling awkward, say something about myself. Works here, right? I mean, tends to be, or ask a question. That's another one. Ask a question. I don't normally talk about my family and stuff, but it's like my sister. Don't speak to my sister much. We're completely different people. I told her about my assessment. I mean, I don't really speak to, don't see her at all, pretty much. It's like, it can be a real sense of, why do I even bother there? But she's my sister. You know, I care about my sister. I care about people. But yeah, she's got her own life. She does her own thing. She works quite hard. And she's got a good job. She's relatively healthy compared to me. Seems that I lucked out and got all the hereditary conditions running through my family, and my sister avoided them. So I take after my mother. She takes after my dad. Don't really see my dad. Don't speak to him. Really got on, that sort of. But yeah, so I told her about my autism, and she told me my cousin was autistic. Had just recently got diagnosed as well. Now, I haven't seen her in a while. I haven't seen her in a long time. She's used to be quite dipsy. You know, it's like, it's not a surprise at all. That she might be diagnosed as being autistic. It's like, you know, it's like, let's get out the lava, shall we? So yeah, I mean, and as I've been saying, I mean, autism is currently understood to be expressed as a genetic mutation. That makes it more or less hereditary. It runs in families. Quite often, it's what's happening these days is it's being identified in children, because there's more understanding of it in children. But then their parents are realising that actually they have these traits too. So quite often, they seek assessment, and then because it wasn't picked up because it wasn't understood when they were a kid, and then as I say, friends and family get assessed, and the feedback from being assessed, they're kind of like, oh, actually, that's me. So then they end up getting assessed, and it carries on being a cycle like that, because the awareness of autism is spreading, and it's a lot more prevalent than people think. And it tends to run in families, and quite frankly, so I said to my sister that she might be autistic, that it might be worth considering. And she went mental at me. I mean, well, it was only a might be. I'm not saying she is or isn't. In my personal opinion, she might well be. She's had issues in the past, and some of her behaviours can be. I would class her as autistic. I'd certainly class her as autistic. I mean, and it would make sense if with autism being hereditary, that she might have a chance. But the other thing as well is that there's workplace protections if you're for being autistic. Because the time most adults, if they're not got family that are picking it up and doing it that way, often only find out when they're actually getting into trouble for it repeatedly. I mean, in that sense, there's a lot of people who dismiss and think that autism is just an excuse for people who keep getting in trouble, and it's like, it's not. The difference is quite simple, because people with autism tend to get into trouble, but they don't mean to get into trouble. They might offend people and without meaning to offend people. Might do things that are considered rude or inappropriate, that they don't mean the actions. They mean the actions. It's just they don't necessarily think that they're inappropriate, because it might not be inappropriate to them. For example, if they overshare like I do, it might be because one of their principles, or one of the things they've discovered, is that communication tends to help with understanding. If you can talk about things, then there aren't necessarily that many issues. What's quite interesting though is when two autistic people, when they interact, they can either be good or bad. If they have similar personalities and similar experiences, then they tend to react quite well to. There might be quite good reactions simply because autistic people tend to be slightly more tolerant, simply by virtue of the fact that quite often they want tolerance, and they know the way they behave, and therefore they're more willing to give it to other people. On the other hand, a lot of tolerance might be, it's just that simply they might not understand what the issue is. I mean, there might be, it's like, I mean, lots of stigma. There might be a stigma or a taboo about something. But someone with autism might not see the point behind that stigma. It might not, they might sit there and ask, well, why? For example, I mean, it's quite often, it's like, might go, well, if people are upset with their gender, for example, and are having issues, or it's not right, why can't they change their gender? And quite often the answer ends up being, for them, is that, well, there is nothing stopping them. So they change it, so they might, if they're upset or having issues with their gender, they just change their gender. They're more likely to be, I mean, there's more autistic people in the trans community, for example, simply because they're the sort of autistic people and less likely to be concerned about the stigma of being trans compared to how it makes them feel. I mean, if it counts as a solution, then why not? I mean, sometimes those solutions can be bad. I mean, it sounds stupid and yeah, possibly quite offensive, but it's just as easy to likely to have someone with autism who thinks that an ideal solution to dealing with something is to gas all the Jews. Ended up with something like the Holocaust. Simply because they perceive that as a viable solution. Based on their principles. Yeah, I'm not saying that Hitler was autistic and that all autistic people are Nazis, but it's easy to understand that sort of thinking when you get into that sort of mindset. You know, there is no, because it's about boundaries, and quite often it's about challenging those boundaries. Where what works is if it's a solution and it works, shouldn't have done that. Should have. Then that's okay, you know. Except it might not be perceived as okay. I mean, for me personally, and I will have to state this, I mean, the idea of gassing all the Jews isn't a solution. You know, I believe in the rights of people, and that people should be safe and happy and not have to deal with things. So the idea that gassing the Jews might actually be a solution, well, that's abhorrent to me. I'll go out and say it is 100% abhorrent to me. There's just no. Why would people do that? But I can understand why people would do that. Because I can understand their thinking in an objective sense. But that doesn't mean the thinking is technically right. It's just I can understand the process of how they got there, and that's the conclusions that they come up with. I mean, luckily most autistic people don't come up with those sort of solutions. But it's just, my point is that there's the feedback that some people, oh, you should know. Autistic people generally don't. And it's not because of a lack of experience. It's not, you can train. It's not, oh, well, you've been told, now you're going to remember this. Because that's the problem. When autistic people are processing things, they don't necessarily remember what they've been told. They don't necessarily have access to that information. Doesn't make it a choice or mean that they're mean to be rude. It's just you might have to remind them every now and then, even if it's a bit like you might have to remind some people your name every now and then, or your gender if you've changed it and it's not obvious. You know, or other things like that. I mean, sometimes, and this sounds stupid, You might have to remind people you're autistic. It can seem like you're going on, but you know that you don't need to. That you're, but in the end, you don't know what people are thinking. And guess you can get. You might be able to guess, but you don't know. And therefore, quite often, people with autism, they won't necessarily assume that people know what they know. But on the other hand, they might forget that people don't know. And the thing is, I'm kind of practicing my multitasking here, just kind of talking, trying to make a coherent, not quite offensive kind of discussion on autism and boundaries and taboos and stuff like that. With the, well, I just kind of, you know, and yes, it does occur to me at the moment that I have just implied that maybe Nazis are autistic. But then that's the point. Anybody can be autistic. Getting back to my sister was like, well, she can't be autistic. How do you know you can't be autistic? Well, I just know. Well, that's the thing. Everyone just knows what's normal for them. That's the point. And quite often, autistic people will end up masking because of the stigma and the fact that they often get attacked because of their issues. Sometimes people think because they're purposely being offensive with what they're saying, therefore they won't say it. Therefore they won't say anything because they won't know, and that's. But it's easy to get overwhelmed and frustrated because that's normal, and there's this assumption, well, that everybody's going through that. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. That's the hard part. What you think might be normal isn't necessarily normal. And of course, if you don't know about something, then quite often you're not going to be able to manage it. You might think something's wrong, or you might unconsciously learn or react processes to managing. But you might not necessarily know why. And the big benefit, I think, of actually having my autism assessment is that, yeah, okay, I know this issue. This issue is not just that I'm autistic. I mean, I've kind of been aware of that for a while. I got into a lot of trouble, and quite constantly it feels like I'm slightly out of sync, that people aren't getting me, that it feels like that all the time, quite all the time. You know, that people are taking what I'm saying the wrong way, either deliberately, or just because I'm not saying it right, or they're not understanding, or, you know, because it can be hard to express when you've got a lot of information. There's another one somewhere. So yeah, my sister went, well, mental. She was like, how dare you don't know me, blah blah blah. And it's like, I know you growing up. People don't change that much. And like I said, there's workplace protections these days. So, and I know she's been in trouble. And I know that she's got stressed at work. She's quite the workaholic. As if that's a bad thing. So, well, not, I mean, but it's not though, is it? Really? It's like saying people's obsessions are... It's not necessarily the obsession that's an issue for people. It's how that obsession affects their life and the life of others around them. If your obsession is work, that's great. If your obsession is setting things on fire, then yeah, maybe not so much. Get over her. Okay. And so yeah, I mean, it's workplace protections. That's why I mentioned it. And like I said, my cousin's been diagnosed, and it's probably coming from my mother's family side, and there's a good chance that my sister may be autistic. Which means she may want to know the rules and that there are workplace protections. But no. It's like, well, why would you say that? And it's like, well, to protect you. Because you may want to know about these things if it ever comes up. You know, because if it's impacting your life and you have these issues and you don't know why, then you've got a potential solution. And quite frankly, I mean, I wasn't saying she is autistic. But given that it's based on genes and therefore there's an hereditary link, you know, you can't rule it out. So it might be worth remembering. No, that was wrong. Like, okay, whatever. You know. It just kind of just go to show you just how some people think and feel. And I can sort of understand, because I mean, if she's got this stigma about what autism is, how it affects people, then the idea of being autistic isn't one that she's going to be jumping up and down about, is it? I get that. That's understandable. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. This has been Vane doing the Elder Scrolls Arena. If you like what you're seeing here, be sure to like, subscribe, share and comment. Please consider sponsoring me on Patreon. And remember, not all people with autism are Nazis. Not all people with autism want to gas the Jews. That was not the takeaway for my digression into that. It was just like, when you take, that's just what happens when you take away the taboos and the boundaries from society, and you think that that may be a solution, which I personally do not believe in at all. I mean, I do not believe in anti-Semitism or any other form of discrimination. Never have and never will, largely because I often feel like I'm being discriminated against for my issues with autism, and it's nice to have a diagnosis for what that is. I mean, you know, feels like I've got an answer as to why I have the difficulties that I have. And more importantly, it's nice to know that I was right when I was highlighting those difficulties, and everyone was trying to tell me that I wasn't. And I think that's the most important thing, because the take it with autistic, the thing is, autistic children grow up to be autistic adults. So society needs to understand how to deal with autistic adults. And the thing is with autistic adults is, especially if they're newly diagnosed, if they're autistic now, they would have been autistic then. There would have been traits, there would have been issues. So a lot of sometimes it's like you look back and you realise, that's why that happened. That explains that. Unfortunately, a lot of people bear grudges or just don't want to accept, because with the way society is at the moment, you know, and the understanding of autistic adults and what's going on, they things, especially institutions, realise that they have made mistakes, that they shouldn't have done what happened to people. And they wouldn't have done it if they had that information earlier. And the thing is, it's like, the issue is, why do you need that information? Why would that information be required for you to change your behaviour? You should treat people like that anyway. The general rule is that I find is to go through life as if everybody's autistic. You know, give them that tolerance, give them that empathy, give them the time to understand and explain themselves, and don't take things personally. If you struggle in social societies, in social situations like I do, then there's bound to be other people that struggle. Don't force it, you know. And if people are rude, well, you may or may not notice it. I mean, that's one of the advantages. Because it's like, some people think something's rude but you think it's normal, then you're likely to put up with that behaviour in other people as well, because you think it's normal. You just don't think that it might be rude. And then when people discuss whether it's rude or not, you might be going, well, why is it rude? You know, And people act like there's like you just kind of know these rules, and it's like, well, no. I mean, sometimes even if you do know the rules, you don't necessarily apply them, or it's just things that get lost to the wayside. Or some of them are just plain and simple outdated. So yeah, for that, I mean, you know, I'm not a Nazi. That's it, basically. You know, I'm not anti-Semitic. I don't advocate gassing the Jews. You know, and yeah, I can understand where people might get to that conclusion, simply because in an academic sense I can understand, I'm like trained to understand how people think from a stand back. Okay, this logic to this logic to this logic doesn't necessarily I believe that, because it's based on a foundation that's inherently false. And that foundation is the idea is that, you know, hurting other people is a solution. That killing other people is a solution. It's like, life's not like that. You know, and life shouldn't be like that. And it's the people who think that hurting other people is a solution that's the problem. Most people don't want to hurt anyone. It's the ones that do want to hurt that you got to watch about. And I think that's kind of like why a lot of people do escapism with games like Elder Scrolls and stuff like that. Because there are monsters to fight. You know who you can kill and who you can't. You haven't got to guess. And if you do something, you can reload. That's another thing I've heard. You know, you can explore and see what happens and learn, and because the main thing these games are teaching you is just showing you how different they are to real life. Because people are people. You know, you can't just necessarily pick up a sword and swing it at someone to solve your problems. Well, technically you can, but that's not particularly a good method of solution of problems. There are better ways, because at the end of the day, games like this showed you that people are people, and that you can see the difference between people and monsters in a game. But in real life, people are people. There are no monsters. There are only monsters if you make monsters. And if you're the sort of person who makes monsters, then chances are you're probably a monster too. Which is a massive, one of my favourite quotes by, is it Friedrich Nietzsche? I think that's how you pronounce his surname. I've never got that right. Be wary when fighting monsters, lest you become a monster too. Which basically says, I mean, when you're dealing with people, you know, if you start treating them as if they're monsters, as if they're barbarians, as if they're less than human, then you have to be careful, because that behaviour tends to make you less of a human in the eyes of others. It makes you a monster, makes you a barbarian. You are just as bad. And at the end of the day, for a colloquial terms, that's how you define Tories. Tories are basically people who are busy being scared of other Tories and therefore fighting them, as opposed to merely opposing them, because, you know, they're not necessarily scared of what they do. It's just they're trying to convince people that there's no reason to be scared. I don't know if any of that made sense. Yeah, whatever, okay. Again, this has been Vane doing Let's Play the Elder Scrolls Arena. If you like what you're seeing here, be sure to like, subscribe, share and comment. Please consider sponsoring me on Patreon. Apologies if I've offended anyone. Unsubscribe if you want. And don't gas the Jews. There you go.